There's nothing quite like the silence of a house where laughter once lived. For 3 years, Maelis Fletcher had been writing letters to her dead husband, sealing them with tears and sending them into the winter wind like prayers. The 62-year-old widow lived in the mountain village of Thornwick, where folks kept to themselves, and old stories whispered of things that walked the dark woods. Every week, she would write about her day, her loneliness, her memories of Thomas, and tuck the letters beneath the old oak tree where he once carved their names. But on this snowy December night, her shaking hands made a terrible mistake. She left her letter at the crossroads instead. That letter spoke of missing warm arms around her, of wanting someone to share the long nights with, of a heart that ached for companionship. What she didn't know was that something ancient would find those words, something that understood loneliness in ways no mortal should. When shadows began moving around her cottage and wolves started howling, Maelis realized her mistake had awakened a darkness beyond imagination. What happens when grief calls out to something that has been alone for centuries? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Thornwick clung to the mountainside like a prayer whispered against the wind. Stone cottages with thatched roofs dotted the landscape, their chimneys sending thin ribbons of smoke into the crisp December air. Beyond the last fence posts, where the cultivated world ended and wilderness began, ancient forests stretched toward peaks that scraped the belly of storm clouds. Local folklore claimed those woods were cursed, home to things that had never known the warmth of hearth fires or the comfort of human company. Maelis Fletcher had lived in this place for 43 years, first as Thomas's young bride, then as his devoted wife, and now as his grieving widow. Her cottage sat near the village edge, close enough to hear the church bells, but far enough to tend her herb garden without nosy neighbors peering over the stone wall. The garden itself was her pride, rows of lavender, chamomile, and sage that she dried in bundles hanging from her kitchen rafters. Villagers came to her door seeking remedies for ailments both common and mysterious, knowing her gentle hands could coax healing from the earth itself. Thomas's carved oak tree stood 50 paces from her front door, its trunk bearing the initials TF plus MK inside a weathered heart. He had carved it during their courtship, when her name was still Maelis Whitmore, and the world seemed full of endless possibilities. The tree had grown around his handiwork over the decades, bark healing over the cuts, but never quite erasing them. She could trace the letters with her fingertips, and remember being 17, watching him work with his pocket knife while she gathered wildflowers for her mother's table. Every morning began the same way. Maelis would wake before dawn, stoke the fire that had banked overnight, and put the kettle on for tea. She would dress in layers, wool stockings, heavy skirt, Thomas's old sweater that still held traces of his scent in the fibers. Then she would tend to her morning prayers, not the formal recitations Father Benedict expected in church, but quiet conversations with whatever force had guided her through 6 decades of joy and sorrow. The letter-writing ritual had begun 3 months after Thomas's burial. She had found herself speaking aloud to empty rooms, sharing news about the neighbor's new baby, or complaining about the baker's prices. The cottage absorbed her words like a sponge, offering no response beyond the settling of old timbers and the whisper of wind through loose shutters. Writing the letters gave her voice somewhere to go, a purpose for all the thoughts that accumulated throughout each day. Thomas had been a carpenter, known throughout the valley for his precise joints and beautiful inlay work. His hands had been gentle but strong, capable of coaxing intricate patterns from stubborn wood or soothing Maelis's headaches with the lightest touch. He had loved quietly, the way mountains love valleys, with steady presence rather than grand gestures. When pneumonia took him during the harsh winter 3 years past, he had slipped away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a workshop full of half-finished projects and a wife who had forgotten how to exist without him. The villagers respected Maelis's grief without trying to rush her past it. They understood that some losses carved themselves so deeply into the heart that healing took whatever time it demanded. Mrs. Hartwell, the baker's wife, still saved the end pieces of her finest bread for Maelis's weekly visits. Young Clara Morrison brought her sick children when fevers wouldn't break, trusting Maelis's herbal knowledge over the physician's harsh medicines. Father Benedict checked on her regularly, not to pressure her toward remarriage or social activities, but to ensure she wasn't drowning in solitude. "The Lord gives us grief as proof of love," he had told her once, sitting in her kitchen while she prepared a tincture for his rheumatic joints. "But he also gives us community to carry us through the darkest valleys." Maelis had smiled and nodded, appreciating his concern while knowing that some valleys could only be walked alone. The community had indeed sustained her through the immediate shock of loss, bringing casseroles and chopped firewood, handling the funeral arrangements when she could barely remember to eat. But the deeper work of learning to live without Thomas, that was something she had to navigate step by careful step. Her daily routines had become anchors in the storm of grief. She would tend her garden, gather herbs, prepare meals for one instead of two. She would mend clothes and darn stockings, keep the cottage tidy, maintain the small rituals that made a house feel like home. In the afternoons, she often walked the village paths, stopping to chat with neighbors or help with minor troubles. Her presence brought comfort to others. The widow who had survived her loss with grace intact, who could listen to smaller griefs without minimizing them. But the evenings belonged to Thomas. After supper, she would sit by the fire with her writing materials, good paper saved from their wedding supplies, a fountain pen he had given her for their 20th anniversary, sealing wax that smelled of lavender from her garden. The letters began simply, recounting the day's events as if he were away on a carpentry job and would return home soon. Over time, they had deepened into conversations about loneliness, regret, hope, and the strange business of continuing to love someone who could no longer love you back. The village itself seemed to understand her need for these rituals. Thornwick had always been a place where old customs persisted, where people left bread for hungry spirits and hung iron horseshoes above their doors. The crossroads where Maelis had mistakenly left her letter was known locally as a place where the natural world thinned, where careful folk made signs against evil and hurried past after dark. Ancient standing stones marked the intersection, covered in moss and carved with symbols no living person could read. Father Benedict had tried to discourage such beliefs, preaching about the dangers of pagan superstition, but even he wore a small silver cross beneath his robes and avoided the crossroads on moonless nights. The church's authority extended only so far into these mountain communities where winter storms could cut off contact with the outside world for months at a time. People learned to respect forces beyond human understanding, whether they called them God or something older. Wilhelm Kroger, Maelis's elderly neighbor, was the village's unofficial keeper of local folklore. He had lived in Thornwick for 87 years, inheriting stories from his grandfather, who had inherited them from his grandfather before him. According to Wilhelm, the crossroads had been a sacred site long before Christianity reached these mountains. Travelers had left offerings there for centuries: bread for safe journeys, wine for good weather, flowers for the souls of the dead. The old ways don't die easy, Wilhelm had told Maelis once, accepting a jar of her honey as payment for splitting firewood. They just sleep under new names, waiting for someone to remember. Clara Morrison was perhaps Maelis's closest connection to the younger generation. 28 years old with 2 small children and a husband who worked in the copper mines, Clara embodied the struggles of raising a family in an isolated community. Her son had been born with weak lungs, requiring careful tending through each winter's respiratory challenges. Her daughter, barely walking, had inherited her mother's bright curiosity, along with a tendency toward mysterious fevers. "I don't know what we'd do without you," Clara had said just last week, clutching a bottle of Maelis's elderberry syrup, while her son coughed in the background. "The physician costs too much, and half his remedies make things worse instead of better." Maelis had waved away the gratitude, remembering her own years of midnight worries when childhood illnesses threatened to steal away everything precious. She had lost 2 babies in the early years of her marriage, miscarriages that taught her the terrible fragility of hope. When no other children came, she and Thomas had poured their parental instincts into caring for their neighbors' offspring, becoming the village's unofficial godparents to a generation of children who called them Aunt Maelis and Uncle Thomas. The cottage itself reflected decades of shared life. Thomas's tools still hung in the workshop attached to the main house, waiting for projects that would never be completed. His clothes remained in the wardrobe, not from inability to let go, but from the comfort of familiar scents and textures. Maelis had given away his formal suits and extra boots, keeping only the items that held the strongest memories: his work shirts, the sweater she borrowed on cold mornings, the leather gloves he had worn while carving their initials into the oak tree. The kitchen was her domain, equipped with copper pots that had belonged to her mother and grandmother before her. Dried herbs hung from every beam, filling the air with complex fragrances that changed with the seasons. Her recipe collection included remedies passed down through generations of village women, knowledge that had kept communities healthy long before trained physicians reached these remote valleys. Winter was always the hardest season. The shortened days and long nights amplified every loneliness, making the cottage feel vast and empty despite its modest size. Snow would pile against the windows, muffling sound from the outside world and creating an isolation that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. This was when Maelis's letters became most important, a lifeline thrown across the void between her solitary present and the shared past that lived only in memory. The particular letter that had changed everything was written on December 15th, during a snowstorm that had kept her indoors for 3 days. She had been thinking about Christmas, their first Christmas as newlyweds, when they had been too poor for proper gifts, and had instead spent the evening creating elaborate stories about the life they would build together. The letter spoke of missing his laugh, his warmth beside her in bed, his gentle snoring that had once seemed annoying, but now represented the most precious sound in the world. She had written about the approaching holiday, about the emptiness of celebrating traditions that had been created for 2 people to share. She had confessed her longing for companionship, for someone to witness the small moments that made up a life, the first snow falling, the way morning light slanted through kitchen windows, the satisfaction of bread rising properly in the oven. The letter revealed depths of loneliness she rarely acknowledged even to herself. Needs that went beyond missing one specific person to missing the entire experience of being known and cherished. As evening approached on that December night, Maelis had bundled herself in Thomas's heavy coat and walked through the swirling snow to perform her weekly ritual. The familiar path to the oak tree was obscured by drifts, forcing her to navigate by instinct and memory. The crossroads lay between her cottage and the tree, ancient stones barely visible beneath accumulated snow. In the storm's confusion, with darkness falling and wind whipping around her, she had placed the letter beside the wrong landmark. The mistake revealed itself only when she reached the oak tree and found the small hollow where she usually tucked her letters empty and waiting. By then, the snow had covered her tracks, making it impossible to retrace her steps until morning. She had stood there in the growing darkness, understanding with sudden clarity that her most intimate thoughts had gone astray into a landscape where old stories claimed hungry things waited for whatever mortals might offer. The crossroads had stood at the intersection of 4 mountain paths for longer than memory could reach. Ancient stones, weathered by centuries of wind and rain, marked each direction with symbols that predated the village church by unknown generations. Moss grew thick in the carved grooves, and local children were taught never to disturb the markers, never to play games too close to where the paths met. Even in daylight, the crossroads felt different, older, more watchful, as if the very air held its breath, waiting for something momentous to unfold. On this particular December night, as snow continued to fall in thick curtains across the mountainside, the crossroads received an offering unlike any it had witnessed before. Maelis's letter lay against the central stone, its cream-colored paper stark against the dark granite. The wax seal bore the imprint of lavender pressed from her garden, and the careful script spoke of loneliness, so profound it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Deep in the forest beyond Thornwick's protective boundaries, where ancient trees grew so thick their canopy blocked moonlight, even in winter's bareness, something stirred. The woods that villagers avoided after dark housed more than wolves and bears. These forests belonged to creatures that remembered when the world was younger, when the line between natural and supernatural had been drawn in different places entirely. Alaric Dracul had ruled these dark territories for over 6 centuries. His castle, invisible to mortal eyes, perched on a mountain peak that existed slightly outside the ordinary world's borders. Built from shadow and stone in equal measure, it housed a court of vampires who acknowledged him as their undisputed lord. They called him the Blood King, the master of the night hunt, the one whose word was absolute law among their kind. He had not always been a creature of darkness. Centuries ago, before plague and war had reshaped the map of human kingdoms, Alaric had been a mortal man, a knight who fought for justice, a lord who protected his people, a lover who had given his heart completely to a woman whose name he whispered only in his deepest solitude. Her death had broken something fundamental in his soul, leaving him vulnerable to the vampire's curse when it finally found him on a battlefield littered with corpses and soaked in blood. The transformation had stripped away his mortality, but left his memories intact. A cruel joke that condemned him to remember what it felt like to be human while possessing the hunger and strength of an apex predator. Over the centuries, he had learned to numb the ache of loss through conquest and control, building an empire of supernatural beings who feared and respected his power in equal measure. On this night, Alaric walked the borders of his territory, as was his custom, ensuring that no threats approached the lands under his protection. His enhanced senses could detect the heartbeat of a rabbit from half a mile away, could taste the fear of prey animals on the wind, could sense the ebb and flow of life force throughout the valley below. It was during this patrol that an unfamiliar scent reached him. Paper and ink, lavender and salt tears, human emotion distilled into something so pure it cut through his supernatural detachment like a blade. Following the scent led him to the crossroads, where mortals had left offerings for countless generations. Usually, these consisted of bread crusts, wild flowers, or small coins, simple tributes from simple people seeking safe passage through his domain. He had long since stopped paying attention to such gestures, viewing them as superstitious nonsense that held no interest for an immortal predator. But this offering was different. The letter's emotional resonance was so powerful, it created ripples in the supernatural atmosphere around the crossroads. Alaric could feel its contents before he read them, could sense the depth of longing and grief that had poured from the writer's heart onto the page. Against his better judgment, driven by a curiosity he had not experienced in decades, he picked up the letter and broke the lavender seal. The words that flowed across the cream-colored paper struck him with unexpected force. Here was grief that matched his own, loneliness that echoed the hollow places in his ancient heart. The writer, Maelis, her name signed with careful elegance at the bottom, spoke of missing warmth in the darkness, of wanting someone to share the weight of solitary evenings, of needing companionship that went beyond mere physical presence. "My dearest Thomas," the letter began, "tonight the snow falls as it did on our first Christmas together, and I find myself remembering how we used to lie awake, listening to the wind, making plans for a future that seemed to stretch endlessly before us. I wonder if you can hear me wherever you are, if love truly does transcend death, as Father Benedict promises from his pulpit." The letter continued with details of daily life in Thornwick, descriptions of neighbours and their small troubles, observations about the changing seasons and the garden they had tended together. But woven through these mundane recollections was a thread of such profound longing that Alaric found himself reading certain passages multiple times, his ancient heart responding to emotions he had believed long dead. "I miss your hands," she had written. Not just their touch, but the way they moved when you worked, the confidence with which they shaped wood into beauty, the gentleness they showed when tending my headaches or helping me braid my hair. I miss having someone who knew my thoughts before I spoke them, who could read my moods in the set of my shoulders or the way I hummed while cooking. I miss being known, Thomas. I miss mattering to someone the way I mattered to you." The final paragraphs spoke directly to needs that Alaric recognized in his own immortal existence. The hunger for connection that went beyond power or dominance, the desire to be seen and understood rather than feared and obeyed. Maelis wrote of dreaming about conversations with someone who could appreciate the small beauties she noticed each day, someone who would listen to her stories without judgment, someone who might understand the particular quality of grief that comes from outliving your deepest love. As he finished reading, Alaric realized that his hands were trembling, a physical response he had not experienced since his mortal days. The letter had awakened something in him that he had spent centuries trying to forget, a capacity for empathy and emotional connection that made him vulnerable in ways his vampire nature was designed to prevent. For the first time in decades, he felt truly curious about a mortal being, interested in the person behind these carefully chosen words. The immediate area around the crossroads began to respond to the supernatural energy radiating from his emotional state. Frost patterns spread across the ancient stones in spiraling designs that had no natural explanation. The air grew colder, and the falling snow began to swirl in patterns that defied the wind's direction. Small animals that had been foraging in the nearby underbrush fled to safer territory, sensing a predator far more dangerous than any wolf or bear. Yet despite the dark power emanating from his presence, Alaric felt no urge to hunt or feed. Instead, he found himself studying the letter's physical details, the quality of the paper, the careful formation of each letter, the way certain words had been written with particular emphasis. This was not the correspondence of a simple village woman seeking attention or adventure. This was the raw emotional expression of someone who had loved deeply, lost completely, and continued to hope despite overwhelming loneliness. The letter's accidental placement at the crossroads took on new significance as Alaric considered its implications. According to the old laws that governed supernatural territories, any offering left at the boundary stones became the property of whoever ruled that domain. Technically, this gave him certain rights over the letter's contents, and by extension, over its author. But more important than legal technicalities was the emotional impact the words had made on his long-dormant heart. For 6 centuries, Alaric had existed in emotional stasis, going through the motions of leadership and conquest while feeling nothing deeper than hunger and the satisfaction of dominance. The letter had cracked something open inside him, releasing feelings he had thought safely buried beneath layers of supernatural transformation and deliberate numbness. He found himself wanting to know more about this Maelis Fletcher, wanting to understand how someone could maintain such capacity for hope and connection, despite experiencing loss that clearly rivaled his own. As the snow continued to fall and the night deepened around him, Alaric made a decision that would have shocked his vampire court and terrified the villagers of Thornwick. Instead of dismissing the letter as an amusing curiosity or using it as justification for hunting in the village below, he carefully folded the cream-colored pages and tucked them inside his coat, close to where a mortal heart would beat. The crossroads stones seemed to pulse with ancient approval as he turned away from the intersection and began walking toward the village lights that twinkled in the distance below. For the first time in centuries, Alaric Drackle was curious about a mortal's life, not as a predator studying prey, but as one lonely soul recognizing another across the vast darkness that separated their worlds. In the highest tower of his shadow-wreathed castle, Alaric sat before a fire that burned without consuming wood, its flames fed by supernatural forces that responded to his will rather than natural fuel. The letter lay spread across an obsidian table that had been carved from a single massive stone centuries ago, its cream-colored pages seeming to glow in the flickering light. He had read Maelis's words 17 times since returning from the crossroads, each reading revealing new layers of meaning that resonated through the hollow spaces in his ancient soul. The silver chalice beside the letter had not been touched in over 300 years. Crafted by mortal hands during his human lifetime, it bore engravings of grapevines and roses, symbols of the life he had shared with Ilara before plague took her and war took him. The cup had once held wine shared between lovers who believed their happiness would last forever, who made plans for children and golden years without understanding how swiftly fate could rewrite the future. Alaric lifted the chalice now, feeling its familiar weight in hands that could crush stone or caress with impossible gentleness. The metal was cold, as everything in his realm remained cold, but holding it brought back fragmentary memories of warmth, Ilara's laughter echoing through halls that had crumbled to dust centuries ago, her hand resting trustingly in his as they pledged their lives to each other before God, and witnesses who were now nothing but bones in forgotten graves. "Master?" The voice came from the doorway, where Victor Lazarus stood with the patient stillness that marked vampires of his age and breeding. Alaric's lieutenant was old enough to remember the fall of Rome, disciplined enough to wait hours for permission to speak, and wise enough to recognize when his lord's mood had shifted into dangerous territory. Victor. Alaric did not turn from the fire, but his acknowledgement was enough to bring the other vampire into the chamber. "Tell me what you sense in the village below." Victor moved with fluid grace across the stone floor, his enhanced senses already reaching out to analyze the supernatural currents that flowed around the mountain like invisible rivers. As Alaric's most trusted advisor, he had served for over 4 centuries, surviving purges that had destroyed lesser vampires who failed to understand their master's complex nature. "There is disturbance in the natural order," Victor reported, his voice carrying the slight accent of languages that had died with the empires that spoke them. "The mortal woman, she dreams of things beyond her understanding. Her sleep is restless, filled with visions of shadows and silver light. The protective barriers around her dwelling grow stronger with each passing hour, though she herself remains unaware of their existence." Alaric's fingers tightened around the chalice. "Protective barriers?" "Ancient magic responds to pure intention," Victor explained, moving closer to study his master's expression. "Her longing calls to forces that recognize innocence and virtue. The very air around her cottage grows charged with defensive energy, as if the natural world seeks to shield her from supernatural attention." The irony was not lost on either of them. While Maelis's letter had inadvertently summoned the attention of the region's most dangerous predator, her genuine nature was simultaneously manifesting protections that could repel lesser threats. It was a phenomenon Victor had witnessed only rarely in his long existence. Mortals whose spiritual purity created supernatural shields without conscious effort or formal training. "She stirs something in you," Victor observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Something that has slept for centuries." Alaric finally turned from the fire, his pale eyes meeting Victor's darker gaze, with the weight of shared history between them. Victor had been present during Alaric's transformation, had witnessed the brutal process that had stripped away mortality while leaving emotional scars intact. Few beings understood better the careful balance that kept their master's humanity buried beneath layers of calculated darkness. "Her words," Alaric said simply, gesturing toward the letter. "They speak of loss that mirrors my own, of loneliness that transcends the boundary between life and death. When did you last encounter a mortal who understood grief at such depth?" Victor considered the question seriously, his memory reaching back through decades of human contact. "Not since the plague years," he admitted. "Modern mortals rarely face loss with such grace. They fight against grief rather than learning from it, seek distraction rather than accepting transformation." "Yes." Alaric lifted the letter, reading once more the passage that had affected him most deeply. "Listen to this. I have learned that grief is not something to overcome, but something to carry gracefully, like wearing beautiful clothes that once belonged to someone precious. The fabric holds their shape long after they can no longer fill it, and there is comfort in that continuity, that tangible connection to love that continues beyond presence." Victor's ancient features showed surprise at the philosophical sophistication of the observation. Most mortals he had encountered viewed grief as an enemy to be defeated, rather than a legacy to be honored. This woman, this Maelis, possessed wisdom that typically required centuries to develop. "She threatens your careful equilibrium," Victor pointed out with the frankness of old friendship. "For 600 years, you have maintained perfect emotional control, feeling nothing beyond necessity, wanting nothing beyond power and sustenance. This letter disturbs that balance." "It does," Alaric agreed, setting the pages down with careful precision. "And that disturbance should terrify me. Instead, I find myself curious about its source." The admission represented a fundamental shift in Alaric's nature, one that carried implications for the entire vampire court. For centuries, His emotional numbness had made him a perfect leader, calculating, strategic, capable of making decisions based purely on logic rather than sentiment. His vampiric nature enhanced these qualities, creating a ruler who inspired both fear and respect among supernatural beings who valued strength above all else. But the letter had awakened something that predated his transformation, something that remembered what it felt like to care about another being's happiness, more than your own survival. The sensation was simultaneously exhilarating and deeply unsettling, like discovering a forgotten room in a house you had inhabited for centuries. "The court will sense this change," Victor warned. "They will view emotional attachment as weakness, a vulnerability that compromises your authority." "Let them." Alaric's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had survived challenges that would destroy lesser beings. "I am curious to see what this mortal woman can teach an immortal about the nature of loss and hope." Meanwhile, in her cottage below, Maelis experienced the strangest night's sleep she had known in years. Dreams filled with silver light and ancient voices speaking in languages she did not recognize but somehow understood. She found herself walking through moonlit forests that felt both terrifying and oddly welcoming, following paths that led toward something or someone who waited just beyond the edge of perception. She woke repeatedly throughout the night, each awakening accompanied by the sensation that she was not alone in her cottage, not threatened, but observed by something that meant no harm. The feeling was so strong she actually lit a candle and searched the rooms, finding nothing disturbed, but sensing a presence that watched her movements with profound interest. By morning, when pale December sunlight finally penetrated the heavy clouds that had brought the snowstorm, Maelis felt more rested than she had in months, despite the interrupted sleep. There was an energy in the air around her cottage, a sense of anticipation that made her ordinary routines feel charged with possibility. She discovered the source of her mistake when she visited Thomas's oak tree and found the hollow where she usually left letters empty and undisturbed. The realization that her most intimate thoughts had gone astray should have filled her with embarrassment or concern. Instead, she felt oddly hopeful, as if some force greater than accident had guided her error toward a purpose she did not yet understand. The worn leather satchel had belonged to Maelis's grandmother, then her mother, and now served as her constant companion during healing visits throughout Thornwick. Its supple brown surface bore the patina of decades, darkened by handling and marked with small stains from countless remedies prepared in kitchens across the valley. Inside, carefully wrapped bundles of herbs nestled alongside glass vials, silver spoons for measuring doses, and small pouches containing the precious ingredients that could mean the difference between recovery and decline. On this particular morning, 3 days after the snowstorm that had misdirected her letter, Maelis packed her healing pouch with unusual care. Clara Morrison's youngest had been fighting a fever for 2 days, and the child's labored breathing suggested complications that might require her strongest remedies. She selected elderberry extract for immune support, willow bark for reducing fever, and a special blend of chamomile and lavender that could calm respiratory distress. The walk to the Morrison cottage took her past the crossroads, where fresh snow had covered any evidence of her mistake. Yet, as she approached the ancient stones, Maelis felt that same sense of being observed that had troubled her sleep. She paused, searching the tree line for movement, but saw only the natural stillness of a winter forest resting beneath its blanket of white. Unknown to her, Alaric watched from a position that would have been invisible to mortal eyes even in daylight. His vampire nature allowed him to blend with shadows, to become part of the landscape itself when he chose concealment over revelation. He had been observing her daily routines for 3 days now, fascinated by the quiet grace with which she moved through her world. From his hidden vantage point, he could see details that would escape ordinary perception. The way she automatically checked the sky for weather changes before leaving her cottage. The careful manner in which she secured her herb pouch, protecting its contents like precious treasure. The slight favoring of her left ankle, legacy of an old injury that caused no complaint but required unconscious accommodation. Most intriguingly, he could sense the genuine compassion that radiated from her like warmth from a hearth fire, drawing people toward her comfort and counsel. Her visit to the Morrison cottage revealed depths of character that further stirred his dormant humanity. Through the cottage window, Alaric watched her examine the feverish child with hands that moved with professional confidence and maternal tenderness. She spoke to the worried mother in tones that carried both reassurance and honest assessment, never minimizing the seriousness of illness while offering hope grounded in practical knowledge. "The fever is concerning," she told Clara Morrison, her voice calm despite the child's labored breathing. "But her lungs remain clear, and her color is still good. We'll prepare a steam treatment with eucalyptus and thyme, and I'll leave you doses of willow bark extract to give every 4 hours. If the fever hasn't broken by tomorrow evening, send someone to fetch me immediately." Clara's grateful tears touched something in Alaric's ancient heart. He had forgotten that mortals could display such selfless dedication, such willingness to sacrifice comfort and safety for others' welfare. Maelis refused payment beyond a small jar of Clara's preserved peaches, insisting that healing was a gift meant to be shared rather than sold. As she prepared the steam treatment, Alaric noticed other details that spoke to her character. The way she included Clara's older child in the healing process, teaching him to help measure herbs and explaining how each remedy worked. The gentle songs she hummed while working, melodies that seemed to ease both patients and caregivers. The small wooden cross she wore beneath her dress, visible only when she leaned forward to tend the sick child, a token of faith worn not for display, but for personal comfort. When Maelis finally left the Morrison cottage, Alaric followed at a distance that allowed him to observe without being detected. Her return journey took her through the village centre, where several neighbours stopped to ask about the child's condition or request minor remedies for their own ailments. She responded to each inquiry with patience and genuine interest, never hurrying past human connection in favour of personal convenience. At the baker's shop, she lingered to comfort Mrs. Hartwell, whose arthritis had worsened with the cold weather. At the blacksmith's forge, she examined a burn on young apprentice's hand and provided a salve that would prevent scarring. Near the church, she paused to help Father Benedict carry firewood, listening as he shared concerns about elderly parishioners struggling through the harsh winter. These interactions revealed a woman deeply embedded in her community's life, someone whose presence brought comfort and practical help to dozens of people who depended on her knowledge and compassion. Alaric found himself wondering when he had last encountered such genuine altruism, such complete integration of personal gifts with community needs. The afternoon brought an unexpected development that demonstrated the growing supernatural influence surrounding Maelis. As she worked in her herb garden, clearing snow from the hardier plants that could survive winter's grip, several villagers reported strange phenomena occurring around her cottage. Her firewood pile, which had been running low, was mysteriously replenished with perfectly cut logs arranged with mathematical precision. Her garden path, treacherous with ice that morning, showed clear stones that remained inexplicably free of winter's hazards. Wilhelm Kroeger, whose advanced age made him sensitive to supernatural currents, mentioned seeing unusual lights around her property, not threatening, but protective, like guardian spirits keeping watch over someone precious. These observations reached Alaric through the network of whispers that connected his supernatural realm to the mortal village below, confirming Victor's assessment that ancient forces were responding to Maelis's pure intentions. More intriguingly, Alaric discovered that his own presence near her cottage was creating beneficial effects rather than the dark influence typically associated with vampire proximity. Plants that should have withered in supernatural cold instead showed signs of renewed vigor. The protective barriers Victor had mentioned were not excluding Alaric, but somehow recognizing his genuine interest in her welfare, rather than viewing him as a threat. That evening, as Maelis sat by her fire, writing another letter to Thomas, Alaric positioned himself close enough to sense her emotional state without intruding on her privacy. Through supernatural perception, he could feel the gentle melancholy that surrounded her like morning mist, tinged now with something new. Sense of anticipation, as if she were waiting for something important to happen. Her letter that night spoke of feeling less alone despite unchanged circumstances, of sensing a presence that brought comfort rather than fear. She wrote about dreams filled with silver light and ancient voices, about waking with the strange certainty that someone understood her grief in ways that even Thomas, blessed though his memory remained, never could. As she sealed this new letter with lavender wax and prepared for bed, Maelis made a decision that would have shocked her rational mind if she had examined it too closely. Instead of placing the letter in the oak tree's hollow, she walked deliberately to the crossroads and left it beside the ancient stones, no longer calling it a mistake, but recognizing it as an invitation to whatever force had been watching over her with such gentle attention. The silver mirror in Maelis's bedroom had belonged to her mother's mother, its surface clouded with age, but still capable of reflecting images with surprising clarity. Mounted on the wall where morning light would catch it through the small window, the mirror had witnessed decades of daily preparations, hair being braided for church, wedding dress adjustments, the gradual changes that marked a woman's journey from youth through motherhood to widowhood. But lately, the mirror showed reflections that defied explanation, shadows that moved independently of their sources, dark shapes that lingered at the edge of perception before vanishing when Maelis turned for a direct look. She had initially dismissed these visions as tricks of candlelight or products of her admittedly disrupted sleep, but they occurred now even in broad daylight, becoming too consistent to attribute to imagination or fatigue. This morning, as she brushed her silver-streaked hair before the mirror, Maelis caught sight of a figure standing behind her left shoulder, tall, pale, with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of accumulated sorrow. The reflection lasted only a moment before dissolving like morning mist, but it left her with an overwhelming sense of recognition, as if she were seeing someone she had been expecting without knowing she was waiting. Alaric's nightly vigils outside her cottage had become a ritual as established as Maelis's letter-writing. From positions carefully chosen to remain undetected, he observed her evening routines with the fascination of someone discovering a completely foreign way of existing in the world. Her movements carried a rhythm that spoke of decades of practice, small ceremonies that transformed mundane activities into expressions of grace and purpose. Through her kitchen window, he watched her prepare simple meals with the same attention she gave to crafting healing remedies. Every action seemed deliberate yet natural, from the way she measured ingredients to the gentle humming that accompanied her cooking. She would speak aloud to Thomas's memory, while, working, sharing thoughts about the day's events or observations about neighbors who had sought her help. These one-sided conversations revealed depths of character that continued to surprise Alaric. She spoke to her deceased husband, not with the desperate clinging of someone unable to accept loss, but with the comfortable familiarity of someone maintaining connection across an impossible divide. Her words carried love without possessiveness, memory without bitterness, acknowledging both the reality of his absence and the continuing influence of their shared life. "Mrs. Henderson's grandson is getting married next month," she told the empty kitchen one evening, while Alaric listened from beyond the garden wall. "You would have liked him. He has your way of listening when people speak, that quality that makes them feel heard rather than merely tolerated. I'm making lavender sachets for the ceremony, something to bring good fortune to their union." The mention of good fortune stirred complex emotions in Alaric's ancient heart. He had long since stopped believing in such concepts, viewing mortal happiness as temporary at best, illusory at worst. Yet Maelis's sincere investment in others' welfare challenged his cynical assumptions, suggesting that hope itself might be a form of courage rather than naivety. Her own hopes, revealed through her letters and overheard prayers, centered not on dramatic rescue or transformation, but on simple companionship. She longed for someone to share morning coffee, to discuss the books she read during long winter evenings, to appreciate the small beauties she noticed in everyday life. These modest desires stirred something protective in Alaric's nature, a recognition that innocence, this genuine, deserved protection rather than exploitation. The village had begun to notice unusual phenomena surrounding Maelis's cottage, though interpretations varied according to individual temperament and belief. Wilhelm Kroger, whose advanced age made him sensitive to supernatural currents, reported seeing aurora-like lights dancing around her property after midnight. Young Clara Morrison mentioned that her children slept better when they carried herbs blessed by Maelis, as if her touch carried protective qualities beyond ordinary herbal knowledge. Father Benedict, caught between pastoral duty and growing unease, found himself visiting Maelis more frequently under the pretext of checking on her spiritual welfare. Their conversations revealed a woman whose faith had deepened rather than wavered through grief, who found divine presence in acts of service rather than formal worship. "I've been thinking about the nature of prayer," she told him during one of these visits, offering tea brewed from her garden's finest herbs. "Perhaps it's less about asking for specific outcomes and more about opening ourselves to whatever form love might take when it finds us." The priest's discomfort with such theological flexibility was obvious, but he could not deny the peace that seemed to emanate from her cottage, like warmth from a well-tended fire. Even he had noticed that his arthritis troubled him less after spending time in her company, that the chronic sadness he carried from ministering to a community that rarely showed joy seemed lighter in her presence. Alaric's own supernatural court had begun to question his prolonged absence from castle affairs. Victor served as buffer between the vampire lord and his increasingly curious subjects, deflecting inquiries about their master's unusual behavior, while privately growing more concerned about the implications of Alaric's emotional awakening. "The others sense your distraction," Victor reported during one of their rare meetings in the castle's highest tower. "They whisper about weakness, about the dangers of mortal attachment. Some suggest that intervention might be necessary to preserve your authority." "Let them whisper," Alaric replied, his attention focused on Maelis's latest letter, spread across the obsidian table. "Their concerns about my authority stem from their inability to understand strength that encompasses more than mere dominance." This latest letter revealed Maelis's growing awareness of the presence that had been watching her. Rather than expressing fear or seeking escape, she wrote about feeling less alone, about sensing a kindred loneliness that resonated with her own. She described dreams filled with silver light and ancient voices, visions of walking through moonlit forests toward someone who waited just beyond perception's edge. "I know someone watches over me now," she had written, "not threatening, but protecting. Not demanding, but simply present. There is comfort in being known, even by someone I have never seen." Perhaps this is how love works, when it transcends the ordinary boundaries between souls, quietly, patiently, with respect for the mystery that makes true connection possible. The mirror in her bedroom continued to show glimpses of shadows that shouldn't exist, reflections that appeared and vanished like memories of dreams half remembered upon waking. But Maelis no longer found these visions disturbing. Instead, she began to look forward to them, sensing in those brief appearances a confirmation that loneliness need not be permanent, that connection might be possible even across impossible divides. The climbing rosebush outside Maelis's bedroom window had been Thomas's wedding gift to her 43 years ago, planted with tender care the spring after their marriage. Every June, it produced clusters of pale pink blooms that filled the cottage with their sweet fragrance, a living symbol of love that returned faithfully each season despite winter's harsh interruptions. But this December, as snow continued to blanket the village in unprecedented depths, the rosebush had begun to bloom with impossible defiance of natural law. Maelis discovered the first impossibly perfect blossom on a morning when frost patterns covered every surface with crystalline beauty. The rose hung heavy with snow, yet remained unmarked by cold, its petals soft and warm to the touch, despite the freezing air that surrounded it. More blooms appeared each day, climbing higher along the cottage wall until the entire side of her home glowed with supernatural abundance. Villagers who passed her cottage stopped to stare at the miraculous display, crossing themselves and murmuring prayers of wonder. Some saw divine intervention, a sign that God smiled upon the widow who had served their community with such selfless devotion. Others whispered of older powers, ancient forces that recognized virtue and responded with blessings that transcended natural order. Maelis herself understood instinctively that the roses bloomed in response to the presence she had begun to acknowledge and accept. Each morning, she would leave a cup of her finest tea on the kitchen windowsill, along with a slice of bread or piece of fruit, small offerings that disappeared during the night, confirmation that her gestures of hospitality were received and appreciated. "I know you're there," she said aloud one evening as she prepared her simple supper, speaking to the gentle darkness beyond her windows. "I don't know who you are or why you've chosen to watch over me, but I'm grateful for your company. The silence feels less heavy when I sense you listening." From his position in the garden shadows, Alaric felt these words touch places in his heart that had been frozen for centuries. Her acceptance came without demands or expectations, offered freely to someone she had never seen. The trust she displayed would have been dangerous with any other supernatural entity. But somehow she recognized the loneliness in him that matched her own, sensing that his presence brought protection rather than threat. The village council had called an emergency meeting to discuss the strange occurrences that seemed to center around Maelis's cottage. Father Benedict reluctantly presided over discussions that ranged from nervous excitement to outright fear, as neighbors reported phenomena that challenged their understanding of the natural world. "My chickens lay twice as many eggs when Maelis blesses their feed," reported Mrs. Garrett, the poultry keeper, "and the eggs themselves, they're larger, richer, as if touched by divine favor. "The well water tastes sweeter after she draws from it," added the blacksmith. "My arthritis pain lessens when I drink it, as if her very presence purifies whatever she touches." These testimonies troubled Father Benedict, who recognized miracles when he witnessed them, but worried about their implications. The Church taught that such powers belonged exclusively to ordained saints and blessed relics, not to simple village widows, no matter how virtuous their lives. Yet he could not deny the evidence of his own senses, could not dismiss the peace and healing that seemed to radiate from Maelis's presence like warmth from a sacred flame. Alaric's flashbacks had intensified as his connection to Maelis deepened, memories of his mortal life surfacing with clarity that bordered on painful. He remembered Ilara's laugh, the way her hair caught sunlight when she worked in their garden, the absolute trust she had shown when plague began to ravage their lands, and he insisted she flee to safety while he remained to lead the defense against chaos. The plague had taken her anyway, reaching into the mountains where she had sought refuge and stealing her life while he fought battles that ultimately meant nothing. Her death had broken his will to live, making him careless on the battlefield where the vampire's curse found him bleeding and desperate among the corpses of his fallen men. But now, watching Maelis tend her impossible roses while humming lullabies that seemed to ease the very air around her cottage, Alaric remembered what it felt like to protect someone precious without seeking to possess them. Ilara had been fire, brilliant, passionate, consuming everything in her path with the intensity of her joy. Maelis was like moonlight on water, gentle, steady, illuminating without overwhelming, offering peace to any soul wise enough to accept her gift. The supernatural world had begun to respond to their unprecedented connection in ways that transcended individual phenomenon. Aurora-like lights danced across the mountain peaks on clear nights, visible only from Thornwick and defying meteorological explanation. Animals that should have been hibernating or fled to warmer territories instead gathered peacefully around Maelis's cottage, as if drawn by sanctuary they recognized but could not name. Wilhelm Kroger, whose folk knowledge encompassed traditions older than the village church, had begun to suspect the truth about Maelis's mysterious guardian. Ancient stories spoke of supernatural beings capable of great love alongside terrible power, creatures who could choose protection over predation when they encountered souls pure enough to awaken their dormant humanity. "There are older laws than those written in books," he told his concerned neighbors during one of their informal gatherings. "Powers that recognize virtue and respond with blessing rather than curse. Perhaps what we're witnessing isn't supernatural threat, but supernatural love, the rarest and most transformative force in any world." Maelis had begun to dream with increasing vividness, visions that felt more like memories than products of sleeping imagination. She walked through moonlit forests, alongside a figure whose face remained hidden, but whose presence filled her with profound sense of homecoming. They would speak without words in these dreams, sharing thoughts and emotions that transcended the limitations of human language. In one particularly powerful vision, she found herself in a vast library where books, written in forgotten languages, lined shelves that reached toward impossible heights. Her companion, still shadow-cloaked but unmistakably real, guided her to volumes that opened to reveal not words but experiences, the joy of love freely given and received, the ache of loss that honored rather than diminished what had been shared, the possibility of connection that transcended death itself. "Love doesn't end," the figure told her in a voice like silver bells and distant thunder. "It transforms, adapts, finds new expressions when old ones become impossible, Your Thomas lives in every kindness you show, every healing touch you offer, every moment you choose hope over despair. She woke from these dreams with tears on her cheeks, but peace in her heart, understanding that whoever watched over her shared not just loneliness, but wisdom earned through centuries of learning that love could survive any transformation if it remained true to its essential nature. The blood-red pendant had hung around Alaric's neck for 6 centuries, a talisman containing the last drop of his mortal blood preserved within a crystalline chamber no larger than a teardrop. Crafted by the dying vampire who had transformed him, it served as both anchor and torment, a reminder of the humanity he had lost while providing the only thread connecting his immortal existence to the man he had once been. For hundreds of years, the pendant had remained cold against his chest, as lifeless as the heart that beat only by supernatural compulsion. But as Alaric held Maelis's newest letter, deliberately placed at the crossroads with clear intention rather than accident, the pendant began to warm for the first time since his transformation. Heat spread through the crystalline chamber like fire through dry kindling, and the preserved blood within began to glow with soft red light that pulsed in rhythm with emotions he had thought permanently extinguished. This letter was different from her previous correspondence. Where earlier messages had been addressed to Thomas's memory, this one spoke directly to her unknown watcher, acknowledging his presence with acceptance that bordered on invitation. Her words carried no fear, only curiosity tempered by intuitive understanding that whoever observed her meant no harm. "Dear silent friend," the letter began, her careful script flowing across cream-colored paper like calligraphy meant for illuminated manuscripts. "I hope you won't think me bold for addressing you directly, but I sense your loneliness as clearly as I feel my own. For weeks now, I've known someone watches over me with gentle attention, and I want you to understand that your presence brings comfort rather than concern." Alaric's hands trembled as he read words that seemed to see directly into his soul. The pendant's warmth increased until it felt like holding a small star against his chest, its light visible even through his clothing, as supernatural energy responded to emotional awakening that had been dormant for centuries. "I've lived long enough to recognize kindred spirits," Maelis continued, "and something tells me you understand grief as deeply as I do. Perhaps you've also lost someone precious, someone whose absence leaves the world feeling colder and less complete. If so, then you know the particular quality of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who care without truly understanding the weight of permanent loss." The letter went on to describe her daily routines, but now framed as invitations rather than mere recounting. She wrote about brewing tea for 2 out of habit that had become hope, about speaking aloud to empty rooms while secretly wishing for response, about dreams filled with silver light and ancient voices that felt more real than her waking hours. "I sense you're someone who has walked through darkness far deeper than any I've known," she wrote. "Yet you choose to offer protection rather than seeking to cause harm. This tells me more about your character than any formal introduction could accomplish. Noble hearts recognize each other across impossible distances, and I believe yours is noble indeed, whatever circumstances may have shaped your current existence." The final paragraph contained an invitation that struck Alaric with force, equal to a physical blow. "If you ever wish to step from shadow into firelight, my door remains open. I have tea that could warm even the coldest constitution, stories that might ease ancient sorrows, and understanding that asks no questions while offering whatever comfort one soul can provide to another. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is allow ourselves to be known. The pendant's heat became nearly unbearable as Alaric finished reading, its glow now bright enough to illuminate the crossroads around him like a small beacon. For the first time in 6 centuries, he felt the stirring of hope, not for redemption or transformation, but for simple human connection that might ease the isolation that had defined his immortal existence. The decision to reveal himself came not from careful strategy, but from emotional necessity. The pendant's warmth had awakened feelings too powerful to contain, and Maelis's invitation offered sanctuary he had never expected to find again. Yet even as he made his choice, Alaric understood the magnitude of what he was contemplating. No vampire in recorded history had voluntarily revealed their true nature to a mortal without intending harm. The risk extended beyond personal vulnerability to challenge the very foundations of supernatural law. Through the village below, word had begun to spread about increasingly dramatic phenomena surrounding Maelis's cottage. Her rose bush now covered the entire wall in impossible blooms that glowed with their own light after sunset. The well she drew from had begun producing water so pure it seemed to heal whatever ailments it touched. Most remarkably, the protective barriers Wilhelm had sensed were now visible as shimmering curtains of silver light that danced around her property like aurora contained in an impossible small space. Father Benedict had stopped trying to provide rational explanations for these miracles, instead focusing his efforts on ensuring that whatever force blessed Maelis's presence remained benevolent. His private prayers revealed deep concern about supernatural influences beyond church authority, but also growing recognition that divine grace might work through channels he had never been trained to understand. The evening Alaric chose for his revelation brought the first clear sky Thornwick had seen in weeks. Stars emerged like scattered diamonds against velvet darkness, and the moon hung full and bright above mountain peaks that gleamed with fresh snow. He approached Maelis's cottage with ceremony appropriate to such a momentous occasion, his supernatural senses alert to any sign that his presence might be detected or rejected. Maelis was sitting by her kitchen window when she saw him, tall figure emerging from shadow into moonlight, moving with grace that spoke of power held under perfect control. Rather than feeling fear at the sight of someone who clearly belonged to no ordinary world, she experienced recognition so profound it took her breath away. This was the figure from her dreams, the presence she had sensed, watching over her with protective attention. She opened her door before he could knock, standing in the threshold with lamplight spilling around her like golden invitation. For a moment, neither spoke, each studying the other with wonder that transcended mere curiosity. Alaric saw a woman whose beauty came not from youth, but from character, refined through decades of loving service. Maelis saw someone whose pale features and ancient eyes told stories of loss and loneliness that dwarfed her own experience, yet somehow made him more rather than less human. "I received your letter," Alaric said simply, his voice carrying accents from languages she didn't recognize, but tones she understood perfectly. "I hoped you would," she replied, stepping aside to invite him in, as naturally as if he were any neighbor seeking warmth and company. "Please come in from the cold. I have tea ready, and the fire burns bright enough for 2. The threshold crossing represented more than physical entry into her cottage. As Alaric stepped across the boundary between outside and inside, between his supernatural world and her mortal realm, the protective barriers that had surrounded her property recognized his benevolent intentions and welcomed him with gentle warmth rather than defensive resistance. "You're not what I expected," Maelis said, as she busied herself preparing tea, her movements calm despite the magnitude of what was occurring. "What did you expect?" Alaric asked, accepting the chair she indicated by her fire. "Someone more frightening," she admitted with a smile that transformed her entire face. "Someone who would make me question my judgment rather than confirming it. You have kind eyes, despite whatever darkness you've walked through to reach my door." And so began the conversation that would change both their worlds forever. The Hunter's Cross lay buried beneath layers of Thomas's carefully preserved belongings in a wooden chest that Maelis had not opened since his death 3 years ago. Cast in blessed silver and inscribed with protective symbols that predated Christianity by centuries, the cross had been passed down through 7 generations of men who had dedicated their lives to protecting innocent mortals from supernatural predators. Thomas had never spoken of this inheritance, had hidden his lineage so completely that even his wife of 40 years remained unaware of the sacred duty that flowed in his veins. Father Benedict discovered the truth while researching the unusual phenomena surrounding Maelis's cottage, digging through church records that extended back to the village's founding. The Fletcher family name appeared repeatedly in documents that chronicled encounters with creatures of darkness, detailed accounts of vampire hunts and protective rituals that had kept Thornwick safe for generations. Thomas Fletcher had been the last of his line, and his death had left the village vulnerable to supernatural threats that his ancestors had successfully repelled for centuries. The priest's hand shook as he read the final entry in Thomas's grandfather's journal, written in fading ink that spoke of a prophecy known only to the oldest hunter families. "When the last guardian falls, and darkness gathers strength, salvation shall come not through violence but through union. The hunter's blood shall recognize its true purpose when love conquers ancient division, and what was sundered shall be made whole through sacrifice freely given." Father Benedict closed the journal with growing dread, understanding now why supernatural forces had been drawn to Maelis, despite her innocence of any occult knowledge. Her husband's bloodline had marked her as both protector and target, someone whose very existence challenged the careful balance between mortal and immortal worlds. Meanwhile, in the shadow-wreathed halls of Alaric's castle, rebellion stirred among vampires who viewed their master's emotional awakening as dangerous weakness. Victor found himself caught between loyalty to his lord and responsibility to their supernatural community, trying to maintain order among beings whose nature demanded dominance and control rather than the vulnerability that love required. "He spends every evening with the mortal woman," reported Lysander, a vampire whose transformation during the Renaissance had left him particularly disdainful of what he viewed as Alaric's regression into human sentiment. "He drinks her tea and listens to her stories as if he were some lovesick boy, rather than the Blood King who has ruled these territories for 6 centuries. "She weakens him," added Morgana, whose own transformation had come through betrayal and violence that made her suspicious of any gentleness. Already his hunting instincts diminish. Soon he will be unable to make the hard decisions that our survival requires. Victor struggled to defend his master while acknowledging the legitimate concerns raised by the court. Alaric's nightly visits to Maelis's cottage had indeed changed him in fundamental ways, softening edges that had been honed by centuries of necessary brutality. The vampire lord who had once ruled through fear now spoke of protecting rather than dominating, of finding strength through connection rather than isolation. "Perhaps," Victor suggested carefully, "we should trust in our master's wisdom. He has guided us safely through wars, plagues, and countless threats. If he sees value in this connection, Should we not consider that his judgment remains sound? But doubt had taken root in the vampire court, fostered by ancient fears that emotional attachment would make them vulnerable to the very humans they had learned to view as prey. Plans began to form in whispered conversations held in the deepest chambers of the castle, schemes that would force Alaric to choose between his newfound love and his responsibility to their supernatural community. In Thornwick village, fear spread like contagion as evidence of supernatural presence became impossible to ignore. Livestock found unharmed but terrified in the mornings, bearing no marks of attack but showing signs of having been examined by something that left no tracks. Children reported seeing figures moving through the forests with impossible speed, glimpses of pale faces and glowing eyes that vanished before adults could confirm the sightings. The village council convened an emergency session, with Father Benedict reluctantly sharing what he had discovered about the Fletcher family's hidden history. The revelation that their beloved healer was connected to generations of vampire hunters sent shockwaves through the assembled villagers, transforming their protective concern for Maelis into suspicion tinged with desperate hope. If she carries hunter blood, reasoned Wilhelm Kroger, then perhaps she can protect us from whatever darkness has been gathering in our mountains. The old stories speak of guardians who kept evil at bay through divine blessing and ancestral duty. But other voices rose in opposition, led by villagers whose fear had overwhelmed their previous affection for Maelis. The supernatural activity began when she started behaving strangely, accused Mrs. Garrett, whose chickens had indeed been laying more eggs, but whose terror now outweighed gratitude. Perhaps she's not our protector, but the source of our danger. Clara Morrison, whose children Maelis had healed countless times, found herself torn between loyalty and growing dread. The woman who had been like a grandmother to her family now seemed like a stranger, someone whose very presence might endanger everything Clara held dear. The trust that had taken years to build began crumbling under pressure of supernatural fear that transformed familiar faces into potential threats. Father Benedict faced the most difficult decision of his clerical career. Church doctrine demanded that he protect his flock from evil influences, yet everything he had witnessed suggested that Maelis represented blessing rather than curse. The miracles surrounding her cottage, the healing that flowed through her touch, the peace that emanated from her presence, all spoke of divine favor, rather than demonic corruption. Yet he could not ignore the growing evidence of vampire activity in their mountains, could not dismiss the possibility that forces beyond human understanding were using Maelis as an unknowing conduit for supernatural invasion. His duty as priest warred with his affection for a woman who had brought nothing but good to their community, leaving him paralyzed between conflicting obligations. The breaking point came when young David Morrison, Clara's 7-year-old son, reported seeing the Pale Man entering Maelis's cottage each night after the village slept. His childish description of someone who moved like smoke and whose eyes held starlight convinced even the most skeptical villagers that supernatural contact had indeed been established. Armed with crosses, holy water, and determination born of desperation, a delegation of villagers marched toward Maelis's cottage on the night when Alaric's court had also chosen to act. Neither group knew of the other's plans, but both converged on the small dwelling where an impossible love had bloomed between mortal and immortal souls. Maelis, unaware of the gathering storm, sat by her fire, reading aloud from a book of poetry, while Alaric listened with the rapt attention of someone discovering beauty he had thought lost forever. They had spent the past week sharing stories of their respective losses, finding in each other's grief a understanding that transcended the vast differences in their natures. "I never imagined," Maelis said softly, looking up from the verses that spoke of love enduring beyond death's separation, "that loneliness could be healed through connection with someone so different from myself. Your presence has awakened parts of my heart I thought had died with Thomas." Alaric nodded, his ancient features softened by firelight and genuine emotion. "You have reminded me that strength can come through vulnerability, that protecting someone precious gives meaning to existence that mere survival cannot provide. Whatever comes next, know that you have returned my humanity when I believed it was lost forever." Neither of them heard the approaching footsteps, the whispered conversations that would soon surround their sanctuary. The hunter's cross lay forgotten in its chest, while the blood-red pendant glowed with warmth that spoke of transformation neither mortal nor immortal worlds were prepared to accept. Forces were gathering that would test whether love truly could bridge the divide between worlds that ancient law declared forever separate. The night that would determine their fate had begun, and neither community would emerge unchanged from the choices that dawn would demand. The bonding ritual. Chalice materialized in the space between worlds as ancient magic responded to the convergence of forces that had been building toward this moment for centuries. Neither fully material nor completely ethereal, the ceremonial cup existed in the liminal space where mortal and immortal realms touched, its crystalline surface reflecting light that came from no earthly source. Inscribed with symbols that predated written language, it represented the ultimate choice between love and duty, unity and division, transformation and destruction. The village mob arrived first, torches casting dancing shadows across the snow as they surrounded Maelis's cottage with grim determination. Father Benedict led the procession, his face drawn with the weight of responsibility he had never asked for, but could not abandon. Behind him, 20 villagers carried crosses, holy water, and weapons blessed by prayers whispered in desperate hope. Clara Morrison walked among them, tears streaming down her face as she chose her children's safety over her affection for the woman who had been like family. "Maelis Fletcher," Father Benedict called through the cottage door, his voice carrying both authority and regret. "By the power vested in me by Holy Church and the ancient duties of this community, I command you to emerge and account for the supernatural forces you have summoned to our village." From the forest surrounding the cottage, Victor's vampire court emerged like smoke-given form, their pale faces reflecting torchlight with predatory intensity. Lysander and Morgana flanked their formation, fangs bared, and eyes glowing with hunger that had been carefully controlled for too long. They moved with coordinated precision, centuries of supernatural warfare having taught them to strike swiftly when mortal threats presented themselves. "The Blood King has forgotten his nature," Lysander announced, his voice carrying across the clearing with unnatural resonance. "We come to remind him that vampires do not love. We conquer. We do not protect mortals. We feed upon them. This madness ends tonight." Inside the cottage, Maelis and Alaric found themselves trapped between two hostile forces, each demanding choices that would destroy what they had discovered together. The walls that had provided sanctuary for their impossible courtship now seemed as fragile as spider webs, offering no protection against the hatred that surrounded them from both sides. "They will kill you if I resist," Alaric said quietly, his enhanced hearing detecting the whispered plans being made by both factions. "And my own kind will destroy me if I choose your safety over their demands. There seems no path that preserves what we have found." Maelis moved to the chest where Thomas's belongings lay undisturbed, her hands trembling as she lifted out the hunter's cross that had remained hidden for 3 years. The blessed silver burned cold against her palms, its weight speaking of generations who had died protecting innocent lives from supernatural predators. Yet holding it now, she felt no urge to use it as a weapon against the man who had brought light back into her darkest hours. "There is another way," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos gathering outside their door. "The old stories speak of rituals that can bridge impossible divides, ceremonies that transform rather than destroy. If you're willing to risk everything, I know what we must attempt." The bonding ritual had been whispered about in hunter families for generations, a theoretical possibility that no one had ever dared attempt. According to the most ancient texts, when love proved strong enough to overcome the fundamental divisions between mortal and immortal souls, the universe itself would provide means for unity that transcended natural law. But the ritual demanded sacrifice from both participants, the mortal risking death, the immortal risking the loss of their supernatural nature. "You could die," Alaric warned, understanding immediately what she proposed. "The ritual binds souls at levels that human physiology was never meant to endure, and if it fails, we both face destruction more complete than simple death." "Then we'll face it together," Maelis replied, lifting the hunter's cross not as a weapon, but as a catalyst for transformation. "I've lived long enough to know that some connections are worth any risk, that love which asks nothing more than the chance to exist deserves whatever courage we can offer." Father Benedict's ultimatum echoed through the night air. "Emerge now, or we will enter and do what duty requires to protect this community from supernatural corruption." Victor's response carried equal finality. "Abandon the mortal woman, my lord, or face the consequences of choosing weakness over the strength that has sustained us for centuries." The bonding chalice began to glow more brightly as Maelis and Alaric joined hands, their combined will calling forth magic that existed beyond the understanding of either mortal faith or vampire law. The cottage itself seemed to respond to their determination, its walls becoming translucent as the boundary between ordinary reality and the space where miracles become possible dissolved around them. "Are you certain?" Alaric asked, his ancient eyes reflecting love and terror in equal measure. "I have never been more certain of anything," Maelis answered, raising the hunter's cross toward the manifesting chalice. "Whatever we become together." The unified heart stone began forming in the air above the bonding chalice as reality itself bent around the force of two souls, choosing love over safety, unity over division, transformation over the preservation of ancient boundaries. The crystalline formation grew from nothing, fed by pure intention and sacrifice freely offered, its facetted surface reflecting not light, but the very essence of connection that transcended mortal and immortal limitations. As Maelis placed the hunter's cross into the chalice, accepting the possibility of death to save the man who had restored meaning to her life, the blessed silver began to dissolve into liquid starlight. The cross that had been forged to destroy supernatural beings instead became the catalyst for their redemption, its protective power transforming from weapon into sacrament. "I choose mortality," Alaric declared, his voice carrying across both realms as he prepared to surrender the immortal strength that had defined his existence for 6 centuries. "I choose the risk of a shortened life filled with love over an eternity of isolation. I choose her." The vampire court recoiled as their master's words released energies that challenged everything they understood about their nature. Victor alone stepped forward, his ancient features reflecting not horror, but wonder as he witnessed transformation that legends had whispered might be possible but none had believed could actually occur. "My lord," Victor said softly, "if this is your true choice, then know that some of us understand. Love that conquers death deserves respect rather than condemnation." Lysander and Morgana hissed their opposition, but found themselves unable to advance as the Heartstone's growing radiance created barriers that their supernatural strength could not breach. The ritual had moved beyond their ability to influence or interrupt, protected by forces older than their understanding. From the village mob, Father Benedict watched with growing amazement as divine light, for surely nothing else could explain the peace that suddenly filled his heart, began to emanate from the cottage that had seemed moments before to represent supernatural threat. The crosses carried by the villagers began to glow in harmony with the ritual's progression, responding not to the presence of evil, but to the manifestation of love so pure it commanded recognition from every symbol of faith present. "Wait!" Father Benedict commanded, raising his hand to stop the advance of villagers who still saw only supernatural corruption where miracles were unfolding. "Something greater than our understanding is occurring here. We must witness rather than interfere." The Heartstone reached full manifestation as Maelis accepted the possibility that her mortal frame might not survive the joining of souls across impossible divides. Her choice to embrace rather than flee supernatural love created resonances that the ancient magic recognized as worthy of its highest blessing. "I see now," she whispered, as transformation began to flow through her body like liquid silver. "That love doesn't diminish when it crosses boundaries. It becomes stronger, more itself, when it refuses to be limited by the divisions that smaller hearts accept." Alaric felt his vampire nature beginning to change, not disappearing entirely, but mellowing into something that retained supernatural abilities, while regaining mortal capacity for growth, change, and the precious vulnerability that made love possible rather than mere obsession. His heart, silent for 6 centuries, began to beat with rhythm that matched Maelis's own. The supernatural longevity that flowed into Maelis's transformed physiology came not as curse, but as gift, her lifespan extending to match his own, while her essential humanity remained intact. She would live long enough to explore the depths of connection they had discovered, to build a love that had time to develop through stages that mortal lives rarely allowed. Around them, both communities found themselves forced to acknowledge truths that challenged their most fundamental assumptions. The vampire court witnessed their master choosing transformation over dominance and discovering strength rather than weakness in the process. The village mob saw their healer elevated rather than corrupted by supernatural contact, blessed rather than cursed by forces they had been taught to fear. Clara Morrison broke from the group of villagers, tears streaming down her face as she recognized the profound peace that now radiated from the cottage where she had received so much healing and comfort. "She's still herself," Clara whispered to her neighbors. "Can't you feel it? She's still the woman who has loved and protected us all these years, just more herself than before." Wilhelm Kroger nodded sagely, his ancient understanding finally able to name what he had sensed building for weeks. The old stories spoke true. Love that bridges worlds changes everything it touches, but it changes it into something better, not something lost. The Heartstone settled into perfect stillness as the ritual reached completion, its crystalline surface now reflecting the unified souls of 2 beings who had chosen to become something new, together rather than remain forever separate in their individual griefs. The cottage walls returned to normal opacity, but the peace that filled the space within would never again be ordinary. Alaric and Maelis stood, hand in hand, transformed but recognizable, their love having survived the ultimate test while creating possibilities that neither mortal nor immortal law had previously allowed. The Blood King had become something greater than his title, and the village healer had discovered that her greatest healing yet was of the ancient wound between worlds. The memorial garden bloomed with impossible abundance 6 months after the night that had transformed 2 worlds, its carefully tended beds holding flowers that honored the past while celebrating the future that love had made possible. Maelis knelt among the roses and lavender, her hands still, gentle, but now carrying strength that could nurture both mortal and supernatural life with equal grace. Beside Thomas's memorial stone, she planted new varieties that bloomed in seasons when nature alone would never have allowed such beauty, a living symbol of how love could honor memory while embracing transformation. "He would have understood," she said softly, speaking to Alaric, who sat nearby, his pale features now touched with warmth that mortality had restored to his ancient heart. Thomas always believed that love was meant to grow, not diminish. He would have seen what we've built here as blessing rather than betrayal. Alaric nodded, watching her tend the garden with the same devoted attention she had once given to her healing herbs. The supernatural strength he retained allowed him to work beside her without tiring, to protect what they had created while sharing in the simple pleasures that made immortality worth experiencing. His transformation had brought him not weakness, but balance, power tempered by vulnerability, strength enhanced by the capacity to care more for another's happiness than his own survival. The village of Thornwick had adapted to its new reality with the resilience that mountain communities developed over generations of weathering unexpected storms. Father Benedict's sermons now spoke of divine love, working through channels that transcended traditional understanding. His faith expanded by witnessing miracles that challenged doctrine while confirming its deepest truths. The church bells rang each Sunday over a congregation that included beings who had once walked only in darkness, their presence blessing rather than threatening the community they now helped protect. Victor had emerged as the bridge between worlds that both sides desperately needed, his centuries of wisdom finally finding purpose beyond mere survival. The vampire court, humbled by their master's successful transformation, learned to see strength in connection rather than isolation, protection in community rather than dominance. Under Victor's guidance, they became guardians of the mountain passes, ensuring that no supernatural threats could reach the villages that had accepted them with cautious but growing trust. Clara Morrison brought her children to visit the memorial garden regularly, their laughter filling the space with joy that honored both past and present. Her son, now healthy and strong, helped Maelis plant bulbs that would bloom in spring with colors that defied natural law but satisfied deeper hungers for beauty and hope. Her daughter learned to braid flower crowns that somehow retained their freshness for weeks, small magics that spoke of benevolent influence rather than supernatural corruption. The cottage itself had become a sanctuary where wounded souls of all kinds found peace and healing. Vampires, struggling with the weight of their transformation, sought counsel from Alaric, who understood the challenge of maintaining humanity within immortal frames. Mortals dealing with loss and loneliness found comfort in Maelis's presence, her own journey through grief providing wisdom that no formal training could have supplied. The rose bush that had first bloomed impossibly in winter snow now covered the entire cottage in climbing beauty that changed with the seasons, while never quite following natural rhythms. Spring brought blossoms in colours that had no names. Summer produced roses that glowed with their own light during evening hours. Autumn showed flowers that seemed to hold captured starlight within their petals, and winter's blooms provided warmth that could melt snow within a dozen paces of the cottage walls. Wilhelm Kroger, in his 90th year, served as keeper of the new stories that were already growing around the transformed couple. He chronicled the small miracles that occurred daily in their presence: sick children healing faster, elderly villagers finding renewed energy, young couples discovering depths of love they had never imagined possible. His journals documented not supernatural horror, but supernatural blessing, love that had conquered ancient divisions and created possibilities that enriched both worlds. "They prove what the oldest stories always whispered," Wilhelm told his great-grandchildren as they gathered around his fire on winter evenings. "That love, strong enough to bridge any divide, becomes something greater than the sum of its parts, something that blesses everything it touches with the gift of transformed possibility." The crossroads where Maelis had first mistakenly left her letter to Thomas now bore a small shrine where travellers left flowers instead of fearful offerings. The ancient stones, once avoided after dark, had become a place where couples pledged their love with confidence that their vows would be witnessed and blessed by forces that understood the sacred nature of connection, freely chosen and courageously maintained. On this particular evening, as summer twilight painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Maelis and Alaric walked hand in hand to the crossroads where their story had begun. She carried no letter this time. Love lived in presence rather than words when hearts had learned to speak directly to each other, across any distance. He moved with the easy confidence of someone who had found his true home, not in castle walls, but in the simple miracle of being known and cherished by another soul. "Do you ever miss the certainty of your old life?" Maelis asked, as they stood beside the shrine that marked the place where accident had become destiny. "Never," Alaric replied, lifting their joined hands to his lips in a gesture that honored both mortal custom and immortal devotion. "Certainty without love is merely existence, what we have built together, this beautiful uncertainty that grows stronger with each day. This is life worth living for, as many years as grace allows us to share." Above them, stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and the memorial garden glowed softly in the distance, testament to love that honored the past while creating futures that surpassed anything either soul had dared to dream alone.